Ready to start your ESG journey? Get going today with Social Suite, and you could start reporting publicly in 30 days. With investor pressure mounting and regulations just around the corner, there's never been a better time to start your ESG reporting. Social Suite takes the complexity out of environmental, social, and governance reporting. Social Suite helps organizations to measure, monitor, and report on their progress with fast, simple, and affordable software. Create value through ESG in order to raise capital, improve brand and reputation, as well as mitigate risk. Social Suite has helped almost 100 micro to small cap companies report on ESG, with some starting their baseline report in under 60 minutes and reporting publicly within 30 days. ESG is a lot easier than you think, and you're probably already doing it. So take your sustainability reporting to the next level with measurable progress. Start your ESG journey today with Social Suite, an ESG software company for micro to small caps. Visit socialsuitehq.com. That's social, SUITEHQ.com to learn more. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not provided as financial, legal, or any other advice. The information is not investment advice or an offer to buy or sell any securities or make any investment. The views expressed by guest speakers are their own, and any reference to third-party products, services, or information does not constitute an endorsement thereof by SNN or its affiliates. SNN expressly disclaims all liability for any individual's use of the information presented in this podcast. My guest on the show today is Aurora Davidson, President and CEO of Amerigo Resources. It's a publicly traded company. The symbols are ARG on the TSX and ARREF on the OTCQX. Amerigo is an innovative copper producer with a long-term relationship with Corporación Nacional del Cobre de Chile, Codelco, the world's largest copper producer. Amerigo produces copper concentrate and molybdenum concentrate as a byproduct at the MVC operation in Chile by processing fresh and historic tailings from Codelco's Teniente mine, the world's largest underground copper mine. Despite the copper price being down from its all-time high in late February 2022, copper has been back to 2011 levels and consistently been above $4 since 2021. In a Reuters column published on January 17, 2023, titled, and I quote here, "Funds Jump Back into Copper, Betting on Chinese Recovery," end quote, writer Andy Holm states, and I quote here, "Investors played copper from the short side for much of last year being 2022, if they were prepared to engage at all. Rolling lockdowns in China, an energy crisis in Europe, and aggressive rate hikes in the United States were all good reasons to give Dr. Copper a wide berth. The fund's sudden return is a sign that many are betting on a much sunnier outlook," end quote. Amerigo also just announced on January 17, 2023, their 2022 production results that came in above guidance, as well as provided their guidance for 2023. With all the news around copper right now, I invited on Aurora Davidson to discuss that and Amerigo's business model and how they're a copper producer without owning an actual copper mine, working exclusively with Codelco and what that means for their business and future growth potential, geopolitical risks working in Chile, and her vision for the company in 3 to 5 years. With that, please enjoy my conversation with Aurora Davidson, President and CEO of Amerigo Resources. Aurora, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here, Robert.
It's great to have you on. So as we do on this stream, the first question I'd love to ask all management teams here is, can you start us off with a description of the company in one sentence?
Sure. Amerigo is a copper producer that doesn't have a copper mine. Amerigo doesn't need any growth capital, and so it returns surplus cash to its shareholders. So I cheated. It's a long sentence or two small sentences.
Let's get a little history of the company. When was the company founded, and then what was the original thesis for its founding?
Sure. Well, Amerigo was formed in 2003, and it was formed exclusively to acquire an asset in Chile, a company in Chile called MVC. Now, MVC had been, at that point in time, doing what we do, producing copper without a copper mine, for 11 years. So MVC was formed in 1992, and has been operating continuously through all the copper price cycles you can imagine, without any interruptions to its operations. So Amerigo was formed to buy this company, to grow it, to increase its production to the levels that we currently have. And with the idea of essentially having a utility type business that produces copper on the back of waste materials from the world's largest underground copper mine, which is Codelco's Teniente mine. And that's where we get our material from. So we can start, as we go through the chat, it'll become more clear to your audience how that is all done. But that was the thesis: buy this extraordinary asset, grow it, nourish it, and put it in the situation where we're now, where we can essentially, operate a company on the back of rising copper prices and be in a position of returning capital to the company's investors.
So the asset that the company really bought, it wasn't a mine; it was the mill, right? Is that
well? Actually, I would say there were two things. There were two components. Okay. One was a contract that gives us the rights or the access to those waste streams, which are called tailings. That's the mining term, our tailings. And it also had a plant, a concentrator plant, which basically produces copper concentrate in the same way and fashion as any other copper concentrate in the world, with the caveat that we're not doing all the work that takes place prior to getting that material into the concentrator. And another distinction is that we work with very low grades, because as you can imagine, the waste materials that comes out of a mine is basically what they don't want to mine anymore, what is left out of their process. And that's where we kick in. That's where we start working with. So part of the magic of Amerigo is producing a totally sellable copper concentrate with very low grade material.
Absolutely. So, and give us a little bit about your background. Were you one of the founding members of the company, or did you come in a little bit later?
I came in 6 months later. So
oh, there you go. Nice.
I joined the company in December of 2003. The company had been formed in the summer of 2003, and I joined as their CFO. So I basically was a company CFO for 17 years until I was promoted to CEO 3 years ago.
Nice. So what would you say your initial thoughts were about the business that ended up being totally false, or in both a good way, or I don't know, in a bad way too?
The first question I ask is a question that any person this day continues to ask of me when I first tell them about Amerigo, and is, why doesn't the mine do it themselves? Why do they need you there? Why are you even in existence, given that you're working with someone else's waste material? And the answer continues to be also the same, which talks about the consistency of the business. Teniente is one of the biggest operations in the world. And for them, volume is what's important. They cannot recover everything that goes through the mill. No mine in the world can. And but it's such a huge mine that the waste material itself becomes someone else's big asset. And in that case, it's ours, right? So it makes perfect sense for us to have that ability of tapping into that material without, incurring all of the high costs that you would need to incur in a traditional mining operation. And it also makes sense for Teniente to give us access to those materials because, one, it's a very small fish to fry for them. But we give them three benefits. We give them the benefit of additional production, because our production counts as their production in their production operation. We give them a royalty. We pay for having the rights to the contractual rights to the tailings through a royalty that is tied up to how much we produce and to copper price. And we're also repositioning some of their historical tailings from an existing deposit into their newer deposit. So it's a winning proposition for both. And as in any successful relationship, and I don't know if you're married or not, but in any successful marriage, both people have to win. And that's what has happened here, and that's why we have a 30-year long relationship with them, and we have many more years to go on that.
Really, I think of my marriage as, you know, like a baseball player. Like if I can hit above 300, then hey, that's a good year. But that's a bad joke. But you know, this is actually a question I was going to ask you a little bit later, but I figured I'd talk about it now when talking about, you know, the contract that you have with Codelco, right? That's the name of the company.
Yeah, Codelco is, and just as a little bit of background there,
Sure.
Codelco is the world's biggest copper producer. Like there is no bigger name in copper than Codelco. They have the most reserves, the most production. They're a Chilean, a state-owned company. El Teniente is one of their operations. They have 7 operations. El Teniente is the biggest one of them. Mm-hmm. And Codelco produces about 8% of global copper. So it's not a small player. It's the biggest name in our industry.
So I'm sure you get this question all the time, but why haven't they just bought you? Why not just bring it in-house?
Because we're a very efficient operation. We are a very efficient operation. We're very focused. As I say, it for them it's a diversion, right? If you have,
I see.
So they wouldn't be as efficient as we are doing it. For us, it's what we are. It's who we are now. So you know, it's economies of scale, and everybody has a place in the world.
Got it. So in doing my research and getting ready for our interview today, talking with Graham and whatnot. So from my understanding, Amerigo receives 100% of its feed to produce copper from Codelco through fresh and historical tailings. So from my understanding, the company has this agreement in place until 2037. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? And also, you know, that's a big risk, right? 100% of your feed is it's all from Codelco. So tell us how the company thinks about this risk, if you consider it a risk even.
We don't consider it a risk. We actually consider it one of the risk mitigators of the company, right? Because as I said before, we're not looking at this as a transition, as a business that is in transition. This is a solid business. We've been working with them for 30 years. El Teniente has a huge life of mine ahead of them. And we have 2 sources of feed. One of them is the original source of feed that has always been in place since MVC was formed, and that is the daily production that comes out of the El Teniente mine. So they produce a significant amount of copper. They send their tailings out through a tailings channel. We get those tailings. And that is, you know, continuous. It's just a river of tailings containing copper that comes into our plant. That was the original stream. As we grew the company, we added having the contractual rights to historical tailing streams. We have the rights to 2 tailing streams. We're working with one of them now called Cauquenes. And essentially what happens with Cauquenes is that El Teniente deposited those tailings in that location called Cauquenes, adjacent to our plant, 75 years ago, through a number of decades, actually. And those are higher grade tailings because, as you can imagine, all operations become more efficient through time. And obviously, mines included, they weren't as efficient as they are now. So that ended up with a higher grade residual material to which we have access. How we see the business is we obviously want to process all of the fresh tailings first, even if they're lower grade. Why? Because that's it's a constant flow of material. If we don't process it, it just goes downstream. We lose the ability of tapping into that copper. So it makes perfect sense for us to receive all the fresh tailings, have our plant set up in such a way that we can process all of the fresh, and then we process the historical tailings as we need in order to continue meeting our production guidelines, but without depleting that. So think about it, the historical tailings are like your pantry. You have your pantry of tailings, but you're not going to be using your reserves until you first utilize your constant material first. Does that make sense?
100%. No, I totally get it. And in, especially when you think about, not just for copper, but, when you're talking about gold production. So, what folks may not totally realize is that there is that waste. There are those tailings, there's the other stuff that is there once you get the raw material that you're looking to actually get out of there, and something needs to be done with it. So I get, if I'm not mistaken, that is really the main thesis, going back to the original question of like, look, something needs to be done with this. And especially when you're thinking about a lot of copper, or well, not just copper mines, but also gold mines, there is a lot of those copper tailings there as well. That's unrealized material.
Absolutely. Every mine produces tailings. You cannot avoid it, right? It's the waste process coming out of your metallurgical process. Now, does everybody utilize them? Not. No, that's not the case. In fact, I would say that Amerigo is the only company that is producing the amount of copper that we produce. I mean, we're the same size as a medium-sized copper mine. We had our news release go out today. We produced 64 million pounds of copper in 2022. So that's not incidental. That's a significant amount of copper. So yeah, what's interesting about our story is the fact that from a material that has already been mined, that would otherwise just be sitting there, we're still able to recover that economic value.
So let's talk about growth a little bit. Some folks might think like, wow, okay, your process is efficient. You're able to do all this, but you are still just working with, Codelco. And I'm sure you get that asked all the time. It's like, well, is there an opportunity to work with some other copper producers and working with their waste or tailings? So love to hear your thoughts about growth for the business.
Sure. And I would say I'll answer your question, but I'll give you two other alternative answers that tie into that question that you just posed. One of them is when we're looking at the level of production that we're having, this was an aspiration a few years ago. This was where we wanted to be. So producing 64 million pounds of copper on a consistent basis, mostly from fresh tailings, is something that was always on the books as something where we wanted to be at some point in time when we could, and we're there now. So we're reaping the benefits of a growth plan that started many years ago to get us to where we are at. That's one thing. The other thing is that when you look at our revenue, there are two drivers for our revenue. One of them is, of course, how much copper you produce. The other one is, what is the copper price? And if you multiply those two, you have your revenue. So the stronger the copper price, the stronger the growth in our revenue. So if you are a believer or a follower of stronger copper prices, then you can see how that factors into revenue growth for Amerigo without producing a single more pound of copper. That's just one way of saying it. So
yeah, for sure.
Now, going back into your original question, this, of course, can be replicated elsewhere. We have no proprietary technology. It's metallurgical discipline. As I said before, we work with very low grades. Not everybody wants to do that, but we're good at it, as proven by 30 years of continuous production experience doing that. So there are three interesting factors that we consider are primordial to the success of a tailings business like ours. One of them is, how much tailings do you have? As I mentioned, in this case, we've been working continuously for 30 years. We have many more years of material ahead of us. We have historical tailings, but we're working with one of the world's largest copper mines that has been in operation for more than 100 years. So it already had its backlog of historical tailings available. That's one thing. So, if we were to look for other business opportunities, they would have to be associated with a huge volume of tailings. The other one is the business model. In our case, we're not getting paid a fee for processing the copper and producing the copper, we have full exposure to the copper price, right? So that's key, because that's how you recover the significant investments that we've had to make in order to be where we're at. And the other one is location. In our case, MVC has a terrific location, which is midway between the mine, then there's MVC, and then further down the mountain range in Chile, there is the tailing deposit where we send all of our tailings to. So we get all of the tailings essentially at no cost by gravity, and we send them out at no cost. That's a significant component of, or that's significant cost that we don't have to incur. So if we were to find a similar story like ours, where similar elements of success would be present, yeah, we would probably pursue that opportunity. Are there a lot of them that have the same confluence of elements? No, there are not.
Right, because it seems like with the way that you run your operations, I mean, this could easily be replicated, because especially when you look at the price of some other commodities and the tailings that those produce, bringing in Amerigo or Amerigo-like company and that tech, it's almost a de-risking of that project a little bit, because now like, okay, even if it's a low grade gold opportunity, for instance, whatever those tailings then produce, you can, now turn, make a little money on some of that waste.
Correct. And when we, when we first started, or when MVC was formed, when Amerigo was formed 20 years ago, the price incentive was just not there. This was a huge risk, right? As we move into higher copper prices, there's obviously more incentive to, look for copper under your shoe.
For sure.
Just to give a silly example there. So yeah, I think that recovering copper from tailings and recovering other metals that are critical to the energy transition from tailings is going to be sort of a next one of the next stages of evolution of the market.
Absolutely. How do you think about copper pricing? I mean, obviously, you've been in business for a while now. The company's consistently been producing copper for 20 plus years. How do you think about that exposure to the copper price, and also some of the recent, if I'm not mistaken, I don't follow as closely as maybe some other folks in the junior mining space, of course, but how do you also then think about that with, I think, the recent rise in copper price as well?
Sure. If you listen to our presentations, to our earnings calls, we're very bullish on copper, and there are two reasons for it. One of them is supply. Supply is being challenged. Why? Because most of the copper mines have gone through their better years, through their higher grade areas. It's getting more difficult to obtain the same levels of productivity, of output as they had before. It's costing more to do it for a number of reasons. One of them being, for example, in Chile, water. Water is a scarce resource, and companies use water. There's an education associated with the industry where it may be seen as an industry that's depleting the world of natural resources, or creating a barren environment behind them. That's not true. That probably was the case decades ago. There are many examples of sustainable mining. Miners take their responsibility seriously, but in any event, it's harder and harder to produce, in our case, copper. So the supply issue is challenged, and as producers start reporting their production results for 2022, you'll see that most of them are coming in with production numbers below guidance. Not us, we actually beat our guidance, but that's an anomaly. So when you're looking at any commodity where supply is going to be challenged, there's a support for price. Now, in terms of demand, demand for copper has grown consistently, 1 to 2% every year, year after year, right? And it continues to grow because the world continues to need copper, and that's just traditional demand. When you look at the additional demand associated with the energy transition, depending on who you want to read, 4 to 5% additional demand is not unheard of in those projections. So you're looking at a substantial increase in demand. You're looking at constraints in supplies. You're looking at low inventory levels, and you're looking at a substantial amount of lead time required to put any project into production.
And Aurora, another question that I have for you is looking at the competitive landscape. Are there other companies that are doing similar things to Amerigo out there? And love to get a little bit more perspective on that.
Yeah, we have no competitors that are doing exactly what we're doing in Chile or elsewhere. As I mentioned, there is no other company that's producing the amount of copper that we produce only from processing tailings. Of course, the interest is in trying to recover copper from materials that were not traditionally of interest to miners. There are companies trying to recover copper from what's called the overburden, but that's not what we do. We basically are exclusively working with the actual tailings materials from the mine.
Absolutely. So this is a question I love to ask every all CEOs on here. What do investors get most confused about when maybe it's a one-on-one that you're having with them, or they're seeing that presentation? Well, even after maybe reviewing your presentation,
Mm-hmm.
what do they still get confused about that maybe we can address here about Amerigo?
That's a good question. I think that we have tried to simplify as much as we can how simple the story of Amerigo is, and to portray that even in terms of graphics. So it's a simple business story with a very simple and predictable business model and cash flow forecasting story associated with it. So people are getting less confused now than before. I think that we used to present information in a more mining way, in a more technical way. Even the use of tailings instead of waste materials was confusing for people that were not in the industry or familiar with mining operations. So we have tried to move away from that and just speak in layman terms. On our deck, we have an analogy to a wastewater treatment plant, because I guess all of us can understand how a wastewater treatment plant works. And as soon as we put that analogy out, everybody understood better what we're doing, right? So there's a waste stream, and there's someone getting economic benefit out of that waste stream. How do you do that? By basically producing more copper and being able to sell it at market prices. So I don't think it gets any simpler than that, and people are getting that.
Absolutely. So another question that I ask all CEOs on here, and we talked about it a little bit already in terms of risks and whatnot. But in your opinion, what would you say are the company's downside risks?
You alluded to one of the ones that people seem to be concerned about, which is having being tied to the hip to Teniente, to El Teniente, and not having another source of feed other than that. I mentioned I don't see that as a risk itself. From an operational perspective, there's nothing high-techy or nothing out of the ordinary that we're doing that presents a significant amount of risk. But for example, I'll give you one that was not on the books 20 years ago. It's water. We ran into issues of having very little water available for our operations 3 years ago. And we had actually to curtail processing of our old tailings because they require more water than the processing of the fresh tailings. And it was a confluence of events. Chile was going through a drought and continues to be in a drought. We had water recovery systems within our plant, but they weren't as efficient as they are now. And we didn't have any water stored for a non-rainy day. So what we did there was basically address this as a risk that's going to be with us for the rest of our operational life. We cannot bank on rain patterns becoming returning to what they were 20 years ago. So, okay, let's assume that drought conditions continue. What do we need to do? Well, we need to recover more water in our operation, and we're doing that. So we invested money 3 years ago into refurbishing our water thickeners. That gave us a significant boost in water recovery. And whenever we were in a position of storing surplus water, we stored it. So right now we're keeping about 5.5 million cubic meters of water stored in our facility. That allows us to go through any water shortage periods. Actually, we have maintained essentially our water reserves without having to use them for a number of quarters now. So, that is a risk resolved. So I guess in general terms, the risks are those acts of God, right? Drought conditions, fires, earthquakes. But to the extent that we can mitigate those, we are doing all we can to mitigate anything that is subject to mitigation through management intervention.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing all that. We appreciate that. So one other that I'm sure you get asked all the time, and I ask this to almost every junior mining company, not that you guys are really junior anymore. I think, we're recording this on January 17th. You guys are trading about 250 million. I'd argue probably not a junior mining company anymore. But in terms of geopolitical risk, right? I'm working in Chile. So love to give a little overview on what it's like to operate in Chile and how the geopolitical conditions are right now.
Sure. Prior to October of 2019, anybody in the world will tell you that operating in Chile is essentially the same as operating in Canada. Chile had been enjoying a significant number of years of economic growth, political stability, social
social non-unrest, I guess.
Social non-unrest, social enjoyment, etc. And then what occurred was that there were a series of student protests associated with public transportation, etc. That had a big snowball effect in terms of opening up a series of concerns that the citizenry of Chile had for a number of years. They were associated with social aspects of equality, for example, access to public health, access to education, the status of the pension system, etc. And in response to those protests, there was a very swift response by the government to open up a referendum with the citizens of Chile as to whether they felt they needed a new constitution. And the quick answer back in the day was, yes, we want to have a new constitution that better addresses where we should be headed in the future. And so a process unfolded for the next 2.5 years that ended up with a referendum in 2022, where a new constitution was presented and it was basically rejected. Why was it rejected? Because it was too progressive. So Chile went from we like where we are, we like the status quo, to maybe we want something more progressive. And when they got it, they said, actually, we really liked where we were and we want some changes, but we want them orderly, we want them contained. We don't want to move away from this central line of that has allowed us to have sustainable economic growth too fast. And so we're back into that sort of a middle of the road alignment after a period of 2.5 years, 3 years of questioning whether things would be probably changing and moving a little bit more left than they had been before. So we're back to where we were before, but I think it's still going to take a few more, maybe another year or so to readjust to this new scenario. So all of that to say that there were some elements of political risk associated with Chile, but they were superbly handled by the government, by the society, by the people of Chile participating and ultimately deciding that we've had a second thought about this, and we actually like how things have worked for us, and we want to continue moving along those lines.
Very good. All right, so we're rounding the bend here for our chat here today. So another question I'd like to ask you here, and I asked this to everyone on here. In your opinion, where do you see and also from what you can tell us, where do you see the company in 3 to 5 years, and what would you say are some of the inflection points that will get you there?
We initiated a return of capital program, a return of capital policy 2 years ago on the back of having achieved a level of operational consistent results that allowed us to very accurately predict how much copper we're going to be producing on a given quarter, year, etc. Once we had that, and that is something that we had been working on for a long time, so that was our prime objective. Once we got that, when copper prices started to recover and when copper prices started to strengthen beyond the prior highs that had been established years ago, we immediately started returning capital to shareholders. We have 3 mechanisms of doing that. One of them are our regular dividends. Then we have share buybacks, and we have reduced our shares outstanding by almost 10% in the last year and 4 months. And then we want to deploy what we call a performance dividend. And that performance dividend is tied up to the performance of copper price. So I really want to see the market conditions where we can continually work on those 3 tiers of return of capital. The regular quarterly dividend that everybody can count on, reducing share buybacks opportunistically depending on market conditions, and then as cash reserves start to build up on the back of strong copper prices, return that capital to shareholders. That ties into the growth factor that I spoke about before, which is in our case tied up to the growth of copper price.
Very good. All right. Well, to close this out here today, you mentioned that, you've been with the company basically 6 months since 6 months after its founding. So, as a CFO for 17 years, and now as CEO, how's your experience been being public company CEO? It's not an easy job, so I'm just curious to how that experience has been for you, and maybe how you'd like to see it evolve or change.
Well, it was a big change. It was a big change, changing from just the numbers aspect of things to the whole strategy. It changed the relationship that I had with my peers as well, and we started working together in different ways. We were facing a significant amount of challenges all at the same time. COVID started. We had drought conditions. We had an operation that was not as stable as it is now. So we just went back to the drawing board and have come out of that better. It's a teamwork. It's not attributable to one single person, but coordinating and motivating and being consistent on your daily deliverables, I think, is part of what has worked for us. I enjoy being a CEO more than I enjoyed being a CFO. And telling our story requires having a story to tell, first of all, and having to purge out what works and what doesn't work, right? So it's been a virtuous cycle so far, and I really look forward to continuing to do this with Amerigo for a number of years.
I think that's a great place to end it. So, Aurora, with that, where can our audience go and find more information on Amerigo Resources?
We have our website, AmerigoResources.com. We try to have all the information that you need there so that you can really understand what our company is. We have a very cool video that shows the operation itself. Our presentation is updated every month, and we try also to put in as much information as we can on our production and our financial results releases. So try to make them as standalone a document as we can, So if you look, for example, today at our results release, we also have provided all of our guidance for 2023. So it's very easy to model out whatever you want to model out on the assumption of your take on copper prices based on the guidance that we provided.
Very good. Well, Aurora, thank you so much for joining me today. I really do appreciate it. Good luck. Stay safe. And I look forward to our next update.
Super. I really appreciate it, Robert. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not provided as financial, legal, or any other advice. The information is not investment advice or an offer to buy or sell any securities or make any investment. The views expressed by guest speakers are their own, and any reference to third-party products, services, or information does not constitute an endorsement thereof by SNN or its affiliates. SNN expressly disclaims all liability for any individual's use of the information presented in this podcast.